On the 27th of June 1952, the François, a French newspaper of the time, managed to grab an interview with a mysterious man who claimed to have worked in Nazi Germany. His name was Dr. Heinrich Richard Meter, a 40-year-old ex-colonel and aeronautical engineer. In his interview with the François, Dr. Meter made some astonishing claims about the UFO phenomenon that have been sparking curiosity all over the world. He would state that if flying saucers are in the skies, they were built in Germany, as developed under my orders. Meter claimed that he had led a team of 6 engineers to create what we now all know as the flying saucer, and he said it had had its first successful test flight in late 1944. He further claimed that in the closing days of the war, Hitler had ordered the mass production of the device, at this point now called the V7, in underground facilities in southern Germany. Of the 6 engineers he had worked with, Dr. Meter claimed that 3 had died and that 3 had been taken by the Soviets at the end of the war. And most importantly, the Soviets had also taken off with the technology itself. If what Dr. Meter is saying is true, we can finally put to bed the question that has preoccupied the mind of thoughtful individuals for nearly a century. What is the truth behind the UFO phenomenon? Who created these strange machines and what are they doing in our skies? According to Dr. Meter, it was made in Nazi Germany. Usually when people get into the subject of the UFO phenomenon, the first step for them is to become convinced that there is in fact some sort of phenomenon. And after this, we begin to ask ourselves what on earth it might actually be. It's very easy to jump straight to the non-human, ultra-dimensional, extraterrestrial hypothesis, but first, surely we should put to bed the idea that this technology may in fact have a very human origin. And if there's one group of people, one superpower amongst superpowers, who may have been responsible for an unorthodox breakthrough, it would be the Nazis. This will be the beginning of a multi-part series that will look at the question of whether the Germans may in fact have developed a flying saucer or a flying saucer prototype. But it won't just be asking that question. My objective with this series is to look at this topic from many different angles, including the German and Italian scientists who claim to have worked on advanced technology during the war, the Foo Fighter phenomenon that was seen over the battlegrounds of Europe, and where its origins may in fact have come from, Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler and his remarkable consolidation of power at the end of the war, and the implications this may have had for where the technology ended up. And talking about where the technology ended up, we will be talking about the mass evacuation plans that were executed at the end of the war that saw leading Nazis, scientists, documents and technologies relocated to South America for continued development. We'll also be looking at rumours of crash retrievals that may have happened in Germany and Italy before World War II, what impact this may have had on the Nazi mythos, and indeed on their behaviours, whether that's in terms of science and their conviction about what was possible in terms of advanced technology, or indeed about the possibility in general of making contact with non-human intelligences. This will pivot us quite nicely onto a topic that's been proliferating the UFO disclosure movement over the last few months, that of summoning and potentially of seances and other rituals that may have been used in an effort to initiate contact with a non-human intelligence. And finally, to add to this long list of delightful topics, we'll be looking at recent evidence that's emerged that demonstrates that individuals in very senior capacities in the Department of Defense have been secretly conspiring to get young people to believe a strange myth about Nazi super science and its connections to Atlantis. Quite an ambitious list, I know, and that's why this can't just be reserved to one video and requires a multi-part series for us to dig into this from every possible angle. But I do promise you one thing. Once we've built our foundations and we're able to proceed to the final conclusions of this topic, the conclusions have profound implications. Not just for how you see Nazi Germany and the origins of the UFO phenomenon, but for how you understand the modern disclosure movement and the motivations which may underlie its urgency. But before we get there, I need to take you back to 1944 to encounter an unidentified flying object of a slightly different character. It's July 26, 1944. RAF pilot Flight Lieutenant Albert Wall is flying his de Havilland Mosquito PR-16 on a long-range photo reconnaissance mission over Bavaria. The aircraft is flying with a minimal load and no weapons to ensure it could fly at maximum speed, over 400 miles per hour. At this base there was no competition. Any aircraft, American, German, British, or even Soviet, would struggle to keep pace. As he began his return journey to Italy, Wall's navigator, Albert Loban, noticed an unidentified object approaching rapidly at a pace that should have been impossible.
What was that? What the hell was that? It went by like we were standing still.
It didn't have the propellers that all aircraft in 1944 used. Instead, it was leaving a strange exhaust in its wake. Wall pushed the throttles of the Mosquito all the way forward and started 15 minutes of evasive action, maneuvering to avoid being hit by the mystery object's intense gunfire. So extreme were the maneuvers required to escape the object that the door hatches from the bottom of the Mosquito had been blown off. Fortunately, Wall and Loban both made it back to base and lived to tell the tale of this advanced aerospace anomaly. Though they didn't know it yet, what Wall and Loban had just encountered was the first operational jet fighter in history. This was the Messerschmitt Me-262 Swallow, the Nazis' latest technological development. Where all aircraft of the time used propellers powered by piston engines, the Messerschmitt had jet engines attached to its wings. And because of this, it could fly 250 kilometers per hour faster than any Allied aircraft. Following their loss at Stalingrad 18 months earlier, the Nazis had increasingly turned to technology rather than raw manpower in a hope that they could win the war. And jet propulsion wasn't their only breakthrough. The Germans developed the Tiger and Panther tanks that were superior in armor and firepower to Allied tanks. The SG-44, the world's first true assault rifle, combining, if I can correctly remember this, the fire rate of a submachine gun with the range of a rifle. If you had the fire rate of a machine gun, you didn't necessarily have the range, but if you had the range of a rifle, you didn't have the fire rate of a machine gun. Well, for the first time, the Nazis created a gun that could do both. There was, of course, the infamous V-1 and V-2 rockets, the world's first long-range guided ballistic and cruise missiles. There was the U-boat, the first true submarine designed for prolonged underwater operation, and the Germans also developed the acoustic torpedoes, homing torpedoes that detected Allied ships by the sound of their propellers. Add to that the first operational night vision goggles, and you've got a pretty sizable list of firsts that the Nazis were churning out. Now, many of these stunning capabilities came far too late for the Nazis to really use them. By the time the STG-44 and the Messerschmitt jet fighter were ready to be rolled out, the Nazi supply chains and production facilities were under such constant bombardment that they couldn't meaningfully produce them fast enough for them to have a significant impact on the war. But despite that, these technological breakthroughs did happen. And in fact, ever since the end of the war, we've actually had a deeper understanding of some of the technologies that the Nazis were working on that were far more unconventional. For example, the Silbervogel, a huge aircraft that was designed to reach America, to drop a 4,000 kilogram bomb, and then would continue all the way to Japan. This monster of a craft would take off in Germany, propelled along a 3-kilometer railway track by a rocket. Pretty wild, right? What's useful about talking about these projects is it gives us an idea of the open-mindedness and the innovativeness of German scientists when faced with their desperate situation in the war. Then there was the Kugelpanzer. By the time the Soviets found this device, there was no documentation and no explanation of what was intended. But the name translates simply to ball tank. Another, frankly, astonishing plan was the Sun Gun, a plan to literally launch a giant reflector of metallic sodium 5,000 miles into space, and then use this to focus the sun's energy on any given city to set it ablaze. Scientists did actually start working on this, but when they estimated that the project would take a full 50 years to reach completion, it was abandoned. So we've established a couple of things here. Firstly, the Germans did create some pretty incredible innovations during desperate moments of the war. Not only this, but they are also working on some very far out ideas that jumped generations ahead. And this creates a wonderful context into which we can introduce Another far-flung idea. A disc-shaped craft that looked like a flying saucer. When waves of flying saucers hit the world after the war, people began talking and speculating. Not just in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Roswell, but also in Europe. And when the conversation got to Europe, Italian and German scientists started to say some frankly quite astonishing things. It turns out there were quite a few individuals who would claim that they had worked on flying saucer technology during the war. Firstly, there was Professor Giuseppe Beluzzo, who would come out and claim that Italy and Germany had been working on flying saucer technology as far back as 1942. In an interview, he would state, "Flying discs had been invented in Germany and Italy during the war. Mussolini and Hitler took an interest in it. Today, some great power is using the weapon for study purposes." It's important to know that Beluzzo is no small figure. It's easy just to say his name and say he said this, but in reality, he was actually a minister in Mussolini's cabinet. Not only that, but he was a famous engineer in Italy who had won basically every possible knighthood and award that could be attributed to someone. In fact, I think there is a street named after him. He was that much of a big deal. His claim was that flying discs had been developed by the Italians, but that this project had been passed over to the Germans in 1942, and that he had personally been involved. Now, if it was just Beluzzo, that'd be interesting, but his claims would be bolstered by other scientists who would come forward too. German engineer George Klein would come forward bolstering Beluzzo's claims. Klein would claim that he was present in Prague during the first experimental flight of a flying saucer. The date he gave was the 14th of February, 1945. According to Klein, the device ascended 12 kilometers in 3 minutes and then managed to reach speeds of 2,200 kilometers per hour. If you think back to the story about the Messerschmitt from earlier, this clearly is orders of magnitude faster. In fact, at 2,200 kilometers per hour, this would put it in the speed range of what Kenneth Arnold witnessed just 2 years later. Interestingly, in Klein's interview, he also mentions other individuals, including Klaus Habermohl and Dr. Rudolf Schriever, but also one Dr. Heinrich Richard Mierter, the individual we mentioned at the beginning of our video. And if you remember, Dr. Mierter said the following: "If flying discs are in the skies, they were built in Germany as developed under my orders and probably reproduced by Germans in chains in Soviet captivity." None of this is to mention Victor Schoberger or the Horton brothers, both of whom have claims to their names about advanced technology as well, and whom we shall come back to later in this series. Now, when you take all of this together, we have quite a significant list of names here. Let's add Schoberger and the two Horton brothers onto our list. Then we've got Dr. Richard Mierter, Habermohl, Schriever, Beluzzo, George Klein. That's 8 individuals associated with the development of advanced technologies, not listing other engineers that may have worked with them who are not named. That is quite a swell of rumors of German and Italian scientists claiming that they were indeed working on flying saucer technology just at the moment when this technology began to be seen around the world and was crying out for some kind of explanation. But look, there are actually reasons to be skeptical about this testimony. Without considering each individual on the basis of their own merits, let's just take the fact that Beluzzo, Mierter, and Klein all came out talking about their role in creating advanced flying saucer technology in the post-war period. Now, this is important because by this time the Soviets had moved in and had begun serious denazification and serious consequences for Nazis who had played a part in the war. Now, if you're a Nazi in mainland Europe and you've heard the stories about Project Paperclip, about how the cream of the crop of Nazi scientists were taken away from Europe and brought over to America, where perhaps you're hearing stories about what a wonderful, delightful life they're living now, and their ability to continue working on the technologies they are working on before the war, you might be inclined to associate yourself with some far-flung technologies in a hope that the Americans involved in the Project Paperclip operation might hear your stories and think, well, we should add that individual to our list too. You can see there's a motivation here potentially to make up stories so that you can escape Europe to a safe haven in the United States. Not a crazy theory to have on our table. However, there's another reason to be skeptical as well. If these technologies were indeed created, if flying saucers really were mastered and were flown across the sky at 2,200 kilometers per hour, if there were multiple independent projects at work of different sizes and scales by different scientists, including the Horton brothers, Schoberger, Klein, Schriever, all these different people, then surely that technology would have been witnessed in the skies during World War II over the European theatre. Actually, come to think of it, isn't that exactly what happened?
Ladies and gentlemen, Foo Fighters!
It's November 1944, and pilot Edward Schluter, radar observer Donald J. Myers, and intelligence officer Fred Ringwald are flying along the Rhine just north of Strasbourg. It was a perfectly ordinary mission as they went about their flight, when suddenly they saw something strange. On their left wing, they reported seeing 8 to 10 orange lights flying through the air at high speed. The objects were not being picked up by radar. The lights disappeared and then reappeared further away. The display continued for several minutes, and then they were gone. It was the radar observer Donald J. Myers who named the objects Foo Fighters, taken from a popular cartoon from the time. From here, the reports of unknown aerial phenomenon continued, with many different shapes, sizes, and styles being recorded. There were accounts of spherical or ball-like objects chasing Allied aircraft, clusters of lights that moved in groups, metallic and shiny-looking objects, and even saucers. But although 1944 is the year that American pilots coined the term Foo Fighter, the truth is that both American and other Allied pilots had in fact been seeing strange, unexplainable phenomenon in the skies for many years at this point. In fact, the RAF has reports dating back as far as December 1940, and by 1942, the British Air Ministry began collecting reports of what they referred to as night phenomena. Although there were some cases where wartime fatigue was the preferred hypothesis, there were also many who, quite understandably, thought they were encountering new cutting-edge German technology. RAF intelligence officer Michael Bentine recalled his experience of investigating the phenomenon during the war. Bentine would tell how he debriefed a Polish bomber unit based in England. They claimed that silver-blue objects appeared near their wing on many missions during 1943. They even tailed their squadron while they raided the Nazi secret weapons base at Peenemünde. Those crews told Bentine it must be a new Nazi secret weapon. Now to this day, no one really knows what the Foo Fighters were. Just like with all UFO phenomenon, there's going to be a sizable chunk of misidentification, some including, like we discussed, the possibility of wartime fatigue absolutely can't be ruled out. There will be some hoaxes, there will be some misidentifications of quite natural phenomena. But when you have that much testimony, it's impossible to ignore. There was clearly some sort of reality to these strange objects and this advanced technology being perceived right at the moment when humanity was having its most intense technological war in all of recorded human history, as far as we understand. So with all of these sightings, it does make the claims of the scientists and the engineers who came out later and said we were working on secret technology, it does add something to this. Now, whether or not we can trust them or not, the reality is that people did see strange things. And so when Giuseppe Beluzzo, a cabinet minister for Mussolini, comes out and he says that they were working on this advanced technology, maybe it's worth paying attention to what he was saying. However, if we are actually going to determine whether this stuff happened, we need to be able to zoom right in and identify the key projects and determine exactly what happened to them. So how do we do that? Well, if there's one individual that you need to focus on in order to understand the destiny of all of these advanced projects which were supposedly happening in Nazi Germany, it's probably the most important Nazi that you've never heard of. His name is Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler. In February of 1943, the Germans surrendered at Stalingrad. This was a pivotal point in the war. It was clear to the leadership of the Nazi Party that if they followed the current trajectory, they were very likely going to lose the war, and they needed to do everything possible to try and turn the tide in their favour. And this, of course, included not simply trying to rile up more men and more manpower onto the front lines, but also, importantly, investing in breakthrough technologies that could help them turn the tide of the war, despite being on the back foot. With this in mind, in August of 1943, Heinrich Himmler proposed to Hitler that they start to use the slave labour available in their concentration camps in order to fuel further technological development and production. And with so many able-bodied men required to be pushed to the front line, it's no wonder that Hitler ultimately capitulated. This also marked a defining moment in Himmler's influence in the Reich. He was now coordinating the operational side of Germany's armaments, and following the German army's assassination attempt on Hitler the next year, Hitler would further consolidate more and more power over to Himmler. Now, with Himmler's ambitious plans for production, he needed an equally ambitious operator to enable his big ideas to see reality, and he found this in a man called Hans Kammler. Himmler tasked him with the building and expansion projects required to bring his immense vision to reality. And Kammler got to work, requesting that concentration camp capacity be expanded to a staggering 4 million to support a growing slave population. Just 3 months later, he would expand this requirement from 4 million all the way up to 14 million. A demonstration of quite how desperate the Nazis were and quite how brutal they were willing to be. But the thing is, Kammler wasn't just being ambitious, he was actually delivering in real life. He rapidly put prisoners to work in the construction of what was called the Mittelwerk, the world's largest underground production facility carved out of limestone rock. 20 kilometers of tunnels spread underground to make this facility, with 20,000 concentration camp slaves dying in the process. And this was just the beginning. Plans reveal that the Mittelwerk was just 1/3 of an unthinkably vast, interconnected underground world that was envisioned. As the Third Reich continued to struggle to deliver on the front lines, Kammler's reputation grew as someone who could deliver huge results fast. Soon, he wasn't just a favorite of Himmler, but also had communications with Hitler too. The Nazis knew that they would not win by sheer manpower. It was technology and the supply chains to deliver the technology that would win the war. And as the Allies carpet-bombed any sites that might be producing armaments or technology, the Nazi leadership increasingly turned to Kammler as someone who could move these critical production facilities into underground facilities fast. Needless to say, in the final year of the war, Kammler rapidly accrued influence and power in Nazi Germany. In August of 1944, he was made responsible for the operations and manufacture of the critical V2 program. And by early 1945, as Hitler and his cohorts were taking cover in the Führer bunker in Berlin, Kammler had total control of any aerospace project that mattered. And this is why he's so important to our efforts. If the Nazis were working on something exotic, like, say, anti-gravity or a flying saucer, then it's extraordinarily likely that this fell under the remit of Hans Kammler in the final moments of the war. Especially since during the final days of the war, the Nazi leadership increasingly threw everything towards Hans Kammler as their final hope. As the Nazis lost the war on the ground, they increasingly turned to Kammler's underground as their last hope. On April 3rd, 1945, Hans Kammler had his last known communication with Hitler. Following this conversation, Reich Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The Führer has had very long negotiations with Obergruppenführer Kammler, who now bears much of the responsibility for the reform of the Luftwaffe on his shoulders. Kammler is doing well, and great hopes rest on him." Bear in mind this was just 2 weeks before Germany would surrender. And even though it had been felt in the air that the Nazis were going to lose the war all the way back at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, somehow in these final moments there was a sense that Kammler could do something that could potentially save the Nazi cause. Now look, let's be real for a second. I don't think Goebbels is talking here about some secret flying saucer program which might finally bear fruit in the final moments of the war. I think that's a bit of a preposterous idea. Instead, it's much more likely that he's talking about the production of, I don't know, V2s or Messerschmitts, or being able to bring important technology out into the battlefield so the Nazis could hold out just a bit longer. However, none of that is to say that there might not have been advanced technology going on in the background, and indeed, those close to Kammler later indicated that this kind of research was going on. Historian and foreign correspondent Tom Agustin had managed to interview people close to Kammler, and what he discovered was that while Kammler had been churning out V2 rockets and delivering on his production requirements, he had also set up a secret research group designed to work on next generation technology. Agustin had managed to interview Dr. Wilhelm Voss, an individual who worked closely with Kammler. Dr. Voss was not just a random Nazi. He was an honorary SS colonel with close ties to the big names at the top of the Nazi party. And he was the head of the Skoda Works. What was the Skoda Works, I hear you ask? Well, it was the largest arms producer in Austro-Hungary, and when Nazi Germany overtook that region, it became a critical part of the Nazi war machine, and Dr. Wilhelm Voss was the person in charge. In today's parlance, we probably describe Dr. Voss as someone at the most senior levels of the military-industrial complex. Now, this is where it gets interesting. According to Dr. Wilhelm Voss, the Skoda Works had an off-the-book project run by Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, working on technology that he claimed made the V1 and V2 look pedestrian. He also said that this project was top secret and completely off the books, with a triple ring of security provided by an SS counterintelligence team. So what was it that was being worked on? Well, we can't say for certain, but we do know that the Americans wanted it badly. As the Germans lost control of Europe, and it became clear that the Allies were going to win the war, the American General Patton's Third Armies pressed hard into mainland Europe to secure the final victory. Now, in your mind's eye, with this Third Army landing and pushing through Europe, where do you think they are going to head? Surely, it would be Berlin, the place of ultimate climax at the close of World War II, the location where all of the senior Nazis are known to be hiding out. But no, instead, right when the war was reaching its final climax, Patton's Third Army headed to Pilsen in Czechoslovakia to secure the Skoda Works. If this was just a facility for regular armaments and steel, then why divert so much manpower 500 kilometers south of Berlin, right as you are zeroing in on the Nazi leadership? It's also important to note that by this point it had already been agreed that Czechoslovakia would fall under Soviet control at the end of World War II, and therefore it was understood that the Red Army would be making its way to Czechoslovakia to claim its new territory as the Germans were surely about to lose. In fact, just 6 days after General Patton's army had arrived at the Skoda Works, the Red Army arrived there too, clearly indicating that both sides understood this was a priority tactical location to secure at the end of the war. Yes, it's one thing to try and get to Berlin and get to Hitler, but it's another thing to get the real crown jewels, which is the advanced technology that everyone knew the Nazis were very likely working on. After all, both sides were still wondering what on earth the Foo Fighters really were, and what was this advanced technology that had been seen in the skies over Europe. In fact, the Soviets arrived on the 12th of May, just 6 days after General Patton's army had arrived at the Skoda Works themselves. What does this tell us? It tells us that the Skoda Works was a number one priority for both sides when it came to the close of the war. Yes, Hitler was supposedly in Berlin at this point, and so were the other Nazi leaders. I say supposedly because I'm pretty sure that some of them actually escaped, but this was the location where all of the critical people could have been, the place where you could have closed in on all of the key Nazi leaders and pressed for that final victory. But instead, both sides sent forces down to the Skoda Works to try and claim the advanced technology that they very likely knew Nazi Germany was working on. After all, across the skies during the war, Both the Soviets, the Americans, the British, on all sides, people had seen this strange advanced night phenomena, or Foo Fighters in the sky, flying at incredible speeds and defying all understandings of what was possible in terms of aerospace. And both sides were desperate. One, sure, to finish the war, but probably more importantly, to get their hands on the technology that could win them the next one. It's been 80 years since the end of World War II, and about the same amount of time since the flying saucer phenomenon became a part of our everyday lives. And with every year that passes, more and more documentation and testimony comes to the surface, highlighting that something truly remarkable was going on in Nazi Germany. Despite everything we've covered today, I remain relatively skeptical about whether the Nazis had the kind of breakthrough that could account for a flying saucer or anti-gravity. What I'm most concerned about, though, is how we're being encouraged to believe that they probably did today in the modern discourse around UFOs. But all of that is going to have to wait until part 3. But for now, I just want to say thank you for listening. As you can probably tell, I've got a bit of a sore throat, but I managed to power through. And I'm looking forward to churning out part 2 as well and part 3. My name's Jason Samosa. This has been Jason Samosa's Ufology Moment. And until next time, cheers.